The German naval staff had long observed the United States' increasing aid to Britain, recognizing it as a severe handicap to their own war effort. Even as early as July 1941, German analysts noted the political implications of America's gradual entry. Yet, despite proposals for action against American vessels, Hitler himself had rejected such measures in September 1941. The United States maintained a short-of-war policy, even as it armed merchant ships in October 1941 and permitted their use of British ports. By November, this policy left their merchant marine and critical coastal defenses significantly underprepared. A critical vulnerability was about to be exposed. Then, on December 7, 1941, the unexpected Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dramatically altered the global conflict. While a surprise to Germany, Admiral Donitz, commander-in-chief of the U-boat arm, saw it immediately as a strategic opportunity. He noted on December 9 the removal of all restrictions on U-boat warfare. The time had come to strike at the heart of American shipping. Donitz moved swiftly, ordering U-boats to the North American coastal area. On January 2, 1942, he aimed for great destruction of shipping in the shortest possible time. This marked the beginning of Operation Paukenschlag, or drumbeat. The strategic logic was sound. The United States, though a burgeoning industrial power, lacked experience in anti-submarine warfare. Its coastal defenses were largely ineffective. For decades, the popular narrative suggested America's entry into the war immediately secured Allied supply lines. However, the immediate aftermath revealed a different truth. The U.S. East Coast became a hunting ground, exposing a critical period of vulnerability and unpreparedness. Operation Paukenschlag, launched on January 13, 1942, initially comprised 5 U-boats. These were primarily the larger Type 9B and IXC boats capable of reaching the Florida Strait, and even Trinidad, with their larger fuel tanks. Ingenious if risky fuel storage methods, such as filling drinking water tanks, allowed them to extend their range by an estimated 20 tons of fuel. One of the most successful was Lieutenant Commander Hardegen in U.123. His log provides a vivid account of the devastating early successes. Between January 18 and 1942, off Cape Hatteras, U.123 alone sank 8 ships, including 3 tankers, totaling nearly 54,000 tons within a mere 12 hours. Hardegen noted the enemy's unrestricted use of the 600-meter band for radio communications, a sign of their almost naive lack of wartime discipline. The German naval staff estimated that Britain needed 800,000 tons of shipping sunk each month to cripple its war effort. While actual sinkings averaged 180,000 to 230,000 tons per month in 1941, the initial months of 1942 promised to exceed these figures dramatically. This period of devastating early successes, far exceeding U.S. debris, replacement capabilities validated German hopes for a mortal blow to Britain. It was not until April 1, 1942, that the first partial convoy system was inaugurated by the U.S., a belated but crucial step, signaling a shift from complete unpreparedness to organized defense. But the damage had already been done. The Battle of the Atlantic had shifted to America's very doorstep, revealing a profound weakness at the outset of its war. The initial successes of Operation Paukenschlag emboldened Admiral Donitz. U-boats leveraged the proximity of U.S. coastal waters and the cover of night, operating in shallow depths and surfacing, to attack with devastating effect. In March 1942, sinkings off the American coast were bigger than ever, with aces like Hardegen continuing their relentless tally, sinking 11 ships. However, this period was also marked by internal German conflicts and strategic misdirections that would ultimately prove costly. Hitler harbored acute fears of an Allied invasion of Norway. Despite Donitz's focus on the highly profitable Western Hemisphere operations, Hitler demanded U-boats for Norway's defense. On January 22, 1942, Hitler expressed these fears, and by January 26 the naval staff ordered 8 boats to the Iceland-Faroe-Scotland area. Donitz was perturbed by this misdirection, believing the Allies lacked resources for such a landing. Indeed, deployments for Norway's protection would yield extremely poor results compared to the wealth of targets in the Western Atlantic. This Norway scare significantly altered U-boat deployment priorities, pulling crucial resources away from lucrative American waters and crippling potential offensives. Yet, even as resources were diverted, U-boat command persisted in developing new operational theaters. February 1942 saw the launch of Operation West Indian, targeting the Caribbean during the New Moon period. Lieutenant Commander Achilles in U.161 demonstrated exceptional courage and skill by penetrating the harbors of Port of Spain and Port Castries. In these new hunting grounds, the U-boats continued to inflict heavy losses, with convoy ONS 67 alone claiming 7 ships sunk and 4 damaged by a single group of U-boats. The Allies, though initially unprepared, were not static. The gradual implementation of convoy operations and defensive measures began to challenge U-boat tactics. The Admiralty Net Defense, or AND, consisting of wire nets supported by booms, was introduced for freighter and tanker protection, with vessels like the SS Empire Celt among the first to be fitted. The happy time for U-boats was beginning to draw to a close. The end of the highly profitable period east of Cape Hatteras came by March 20, 1942. Allied anti-submarine warfare was slowly improving, forcing U-boats to adapt or withdraw. This period marks the beginning of a far more difficult U-boat war. Even the U-boats themselves suffered from technical flaws. U.154, for instance, missed with 14 torpedoes against convoy HX 175 due to a badly out of adjustment torpedo control system. Frozen diesel exhaust valves also imperiled crash dives, as documented in U.15 Despite growing Allied vigilance, Hitler, through his naval aide Captain Puttkamer, continued to express satisfaction with the sinkings in American waters, even as his own directives for Norway's defense contradicted this focus. This inherent tension within the German command structure weakened the overall U-boat campaign. The conflict between Donitz's operational goals and Hitler's strategic misdirection would prove to be a recurring theme, ultimately contributing to their setbacks. The German U-boat campaign in the Western Hemisphere had achieved devastating success, but this success was ultimately unsustainable. U-boats had effectively leveraged pre-war shipping data and the initial lack of Allied defenses, yet their operational reach was limited by fuel. A crucial development that fundamentally altered the scope of U-boat operations was the introduction of the U-tanker, the Type 14, Milkau. Appearing in April 1942, these vessels, with their 700 tons of diesel fuel capacity, allowed U-boats to prolong operations in distant areas like the Caribbean for much longer periods. Between May and July 1942, 37 U-boats were sustained in the Caribbean, a demonstration of the U-tanker's vital role. This represented a crucial logistical shift, enabling a sustained presence in previously inaccessible areas. By early May 1942, the U-boat presence in the American zone reached its peak, with 16 to 18 boats active. The focus was clear: strike at the root of the evil, the immense U.S. industrial capacity. However, the tide was turning. The Allied introduction of the convoy system, coupled with improved anti-submarine organization and patrols, progressively countered U-boat tactics. The first partial convoy system had been inaugurated on April 1, 1942. By May 9, 1942, the first convoy was reported near Cape Hatteras. This was a critical shift. The previously easy pickings were now guarded, while sinkings of tankers remained high, with 112 tankers totaling nearly 1 million tons lost between January 15 and May 10, 1942. The rate was beginning to slow. Admiral Donitz initially attributed the decline in sinkings solely to the full moon and fine weather. This proved to be a misreading of the situation. He failed to recognize the systemic impact of the rapidly implemented convoy system. His intelligence also underestimated the true scale of Allied shipbuilding capacity. The US and alone aimed to produce 2,290 ships aggregating 16.8 million tons between 1939 and 1943, with 15.3 million tons projected for 1942 to 43. This immense output would soon render German successes unsustainable. The German naval staff was forced to re-evaluate its policy in May 1942 as sinkings on the East Coast declined. This revealed the widening gap between theoretical shipbuilding capacity and the actual operational impact of the U-boat campaign. Furthermore, the very presence of U-tankers while extending range also created vulnerabilities, as multiple boats concentrated around a single refueling point. The German attribution of the losses of U-82, U.587, and U.252 to unusual causes, was also debunked. They were sunk by convoy escorts before they could even attack. This highlighted a significant intelligence failure and a misunderstanding of growing Allied capabilities. Even in areas like Florida, where Lieutenant Crimmer in U.333 demonstrated exceptional courage evading depth charge attacks in shallow waters, the risks were becoming profoundly clear. While the milch cow revolutionized U-boat logistics, it was a double-edged sword. The primitive METOX receiver, a key technological element for U-boat intelligence gathering, offered only partial protection against growing Allied HAF/DF fixing. The period marks the beginning of the end of the U-boats' happy time. The strategic advantage was slowly but surely shifting to the Allies. As 1942 progressed, the Battle of the Atlantic entered a new, more intense phase. The Allies' anti-submarine warfare was becoming increasingly sophisticated. This forced U-boat command to continually adapt its tactics and seek new hunting grounds. Initial U-boat successes in the Americas had been fueled by abundant, unescorted shipping. But the introduction of the convoy system, first observed off Cape Hatteras and then broadly implemented in the Caribbean, directly countered U-boat tactics. By mid-July 1942, the increasing effectiveness of effectiveness of U.S. Jones anti-submarine measures forced a strategic withdrawal from the U.S. coastal area. U-boats were driven from the coast to seek opportunities further offshore. The Caribbean, which had seen the last significant concentration of U-boat force in August 1942, was also becoming increasingly untenable. Air activity was lively, particularly with U.S. aircraft equipped with radar. Near Trinidad aircraft heavily preponderated over surface forces, forcing U-boats like U.156 to remain submerged for up to 120 hours in 1 week. The convoy system was eventually adopted everywhere in the Caribbean, except the Gulf of Mexico. In a desperate attempt to disrupt Allied operations, German minelaying U-boats were deployed. The specialized Type XBB U.16, designed to carry 66 moored mines, targeted New York, Delaware, and Chesapeake Bay entrances. Mines laid off Boston and southeast of Cape Henry caused significant disruption, temporarily closing both bays and sinking 7 ships. However, even these operations were fraught with issues. UP-116 itself was hampered by a defect in the mine itself, causing premature detonation. In another unusual move, 2 parties of German agents for Operation Pistorius were landed by U-boats on the U.S. coast in June 1942. Both were apprehended before commencing activities, confirming U-boat command's distrust of the agents' capabilities. Beyond the Americas, the North Atlantic remained a crucial battleground. Group Hecht, comprising 8 medium boats, was formed to resume attacks on Atlantic convoys. They achieved initial success against convoy ONS 92, sinking 7 ships on the first night. But subsequent operations against ONS 94 and ONS 100 were hampered by bad weather, fog, and lost contact. Critically, Group Hecht suffered damage to 2 U-boats during an 8-hour depth charge attack against ONS 102, the largest convoy encountered. The most profound shift came with the rapid advancement of Allied radar technology. German intelligence had initially struggled to grasp the capabilities and widespread use of airborne radar. U-boat command attributed initial surprise attacks by Allied aircraft to U-boat commander error or lax lookouts rather than sophisticated detection. However, by June 1942, Rear Admiral Stummel's visit provided the first positive information to FO U-boats that U-boats were indeed being located by airborne radar. The danger of U-boat beacon signals was revealed, with instances of U.94 being approached and depth charged immediately after transmitting signals. The Lee Light, operational in May 1942, enabled dark night attacks by searchlights. By mid-July 1942, significant U-boat losses, including U-boat 2152, 25, 76, and U.701, underscored a harsh reality. 1/3 of the forces engaged were not commensurate with results. This led directly to the order to evacuate the U.S. coastal area. The strategic advantage shifted decisively to the Allies. The U-boat campaign was forced to adapt towards more sporadic, less impactful operations. Then, on September 12, 1942, a single event would cast a long shadow over the U-boat war. U.156 torpedoed the British liner Laconia, carrying 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. In an unprecedented move, Sums .156 and later other U-boats, including those of the Eisbar Group, began a rescue operation. However, on September 16th, a US B-24 bomber mistook the rescue effort for a U-boat attack and bombed U.156. This act forever changed the U-boat war. 5 days later, on September 17th, Admiral Donitz broadcast the Laconia Order. It explicitly forbade U-boat commanders from assisting survivors of sunken ships. For decades, the Laconia incident and the subsequent order have been a point of historical debate. While some argue it was a necessary response to the realities of total war, it profoundly tarnished the U-boat service's reputation. Donitz himself was later questioned about it at the Nuremberg trials. This event underscored the harsh ethical dilemmas faced in naval warfare and challenged any lingering notions of a universally chivalrous U-boat service. This period, from July to September 1942, marked a transition to a new conception of U-boat operations. The unremunerative nature of certain deployments like the Iceland-Faroes-Scotland region was now evident. The Germans were forced to confront an increasingly sophisticated and deadly Allied defense. The second half of 1942 witnessed the U-boat campaign grapple with mounting challenges. The initial success of U-boats in the Western Atlantic had obscured growing vulnerabilities. Early in the year, no U-boat casualties from bombing were recorded in the Bay of Biscay. But by June 1942, free U-boats were severely damaged there. This alarming development forced U-boat command to hastily equip boats with primitive METOX receivers. These devices, though rudimentary, were a direct response to Allied radar detection. Orders were issued on June 24, 1942, for U-boats to remain submerged day and night while transiting the Bay of Biscay. Admiral Donitz personally intervened, visiting Luftwaffe headquarters on July 2, 1942, to secure the allocation of 24 Ju-88C-6 aircraft for air cover, a testament to the critical need for anti-aircraft defense. Meanwhile, Allied air power continued to expand its reach. Aircraft operating from land bases achieved an 800-mile radius of action by sacrificing bomb loads for extra fuel tanks. This significantly degraded U-boat attack opportunities. For decades, some historical accounts have understated the effectiveness of Allied ASW. This period clearly demonstrates the increasing effectiveness of air patrols and coordinated support groups. The Norway scare that had diverted crucial resources earlier in the year also proved to be a strategic miscalculation. U-boats stationed there yielded abysmal results, underscoring a significant misallocation of effort. In the Western Atlantic, despite the challenges, German strategic focus remained on areas with high shipping traffic. Brazil's breaking of diplomatic relations with Germany on January 27, 1942, preceded U-boat attacks on Brazilian shipping. By May 16, 1942, U-boats were permitted to attack armed Brazilian and other South American merchant ships. Hitler, however, had his own strategic visions. A plan to attack Brazil with an overwhelming force was considered but ultimately cancelled due to political concerns. This again diverted U-boat resources from more strategically advantageous areas. The summer of 1942 saw a significant increase in U-boat production. May recorded 684,000 tons and June 78,000 tons of shipping sunk. This surge in available boats enabled a more aggressive resumption of North Atlantic convoy battles. The strategy was to concentrate large wolf packs against Allied convoys. Operations against OS-33 saw 5 ships, totaling 32,000 tons, sunk on the first night. However, these engagements were proving costly. The operation against SC-94 resulted in 11 ships sunk, but at the cost of 3 U-boats lost. This increasing price of success highlighted the growing effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine measures. On December 8, 1942, a grim event occurred during a convoy battle. U.221 and U.254 collided, resulting in the loss of U.254. This accident led to a crucial decision: to limit U-boat numbers near a convoy to 13 to 15. The German reliance on intelligence from radio decryption, while often successful, also led to missed opportunities when convoys altered course or were sighted at the extremities of patrol lines. The war of attrition in the Atlantic was rapidly escalating. The relentless pursuit of Allied shipping continued across vast distances. From the Gulf of St. Distances, From the Gulf of St. distances, Lawrence to the Central Atlantic U-boat commanders sought to exploit any vulnerability. In the Gulf of St. approved, Lawrence 3 Type 9 boats sank 7 ships and torpedoed 2 others between August 23 and September 16, 1942. However, the use of ASTIG was affected by pronounced stratification in these waters, impacting both sides. The Caribbean remained a focus, though growing efficiency of American anti-submarine measures in July 1942 forced a withdrawal from the U.S. coast and a reduced and opportunistic presence. Off Trinidad, U-boats targeted nodal points, sinking 10 ships in a few days in early August. The Windward Passage also saw significant activity, with U.658 sinking 5 ships and damaging 1. But the most infamous event of this period was undoubtedly the sinking of the Laconia. On September 12, 1942, U.156 torpedoed the British liner carrying some 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, along with British military and civilian personnel. In an extraordinary act to 15-6, and later other U-boats, including those of the Eisbar Group, began a rescue operation. Sivers. However, on September 16th, a US B-24 bomber mistook the rescue effort for a U-boat attack and bombed U.156. This act forever changed the U-boat war. 5 days later, on September 17th, Admiral Donitz broadcast the Laconia Order. It explicitly forbade U-boat commanders from assisting survivors of sunken ships. For decades, the Laconia incident and the subsequent order have been a point of historical debate. While some argue it was a necessary response to the realities of total war, it profoundly tarnished the U-boat service's reputation. Donitz himself was later questioned about it at the Nuremberg trials. This event underscored the harsh ethical dilemmas faced in naval warfare and challenged any lingering notions of a universally chivalrous U-boat service. Technologically, the primitive Metox receiver was now a critical countermeasure to Allied airborne radar. However, the enemy's radar was becoming an alarming factor in the Bay of Biscay, significantly impacting U-boat operations. In the Central Atlantic, 2 boats sank 5 independent ships west of Freetown between July 22nd and 30th. Brazilian coastal traffic also came under attack, with UA.507 torpedoing 5 Brazilian coastal vessels on August 16th and 17th, leading to Brazil declaring war on Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic was a brutal contest of attrition and technological one-upmanship. U-boat operations were becoming increasingly frustrated, requiring constant adaptation to survive. By late 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was evolving into a technological arms race. The German U-boat campaign, though still inflicting losses, was increasingly crippled by a relentless and rapidly evolving Allied anti-submarine warfare strategy. The British were making extensive use of airborne radar. This fundamentally changed the intelligence landscape, rendering traditional German U-boat scouting methods less effective. For decades, some historians believed the German U-boat losses were primarily due to compromised ciphers. However, the evidence suggests that the enemy's knowledge of U-boat positions was apparently not the cause, but rather the overwhelming effectiveness of Allied radar. FO U-boats acknowledged on March 5, 1943, that Allied radar was capable of locating U-boats from considerable distances. Orders were issued to dive for 30 minutes upon identification of airborne radar. German scientific analysis concluded that enemy radar was employing very high and very low impulse frequencies beyond the range of the present search receiver, the primitive Metox. This technological gap was a critical weakness. The Metox receiver was merely an ordinary receiver in the radio room, connected to an aerial on a wooden cross, requiring frequent manual adjustment. Its obsolescence against new Allied radar frequencies was becoming painfully clear. A critical shortcoming was a fundamental disconnect between German operational needs and their research and development departments. This bureaucratic inertia hampered timely implementation of crucial countermeasures. Admiral Donitz, in a memorandum to the C. C of the Navy on June 24, 1942, had already pushed for the most rapid development and large-scale construction of the Walter-type U-boats. These revolutionary designs promised high submerged speed, with early prototypes achieving over 23 knots. Donitz persistently advocated for these advanced boats against a hesitant naval staff, recognizing the dire situation. However, despite these visions, the reality was grim. German radar development was lagging. The Beat radar was too large. The Fu MG had a limited 30-degree search arc and a ship detection range of only 8,000 meters. Even German inter-service communication was lacking. The Luftwaffe's Liechtenstein radar, a German development, was only discovered by chance by U-boat command. German anti-aircraft armament was also tragically inadequate. The 8mm machine guns were quite inadequate against aircraft. Det, even 2 centimeters, barrels, or 3.7 centimeters. Quick-firing cannon proved ineffective against increasingly sophisticated Allied air attacks. The Luftwaffe's promising He-177, a long-range fighter bomber, was diverted to the Eastern Front instead of providing crucial naval support. This was a major strategic blunder. Allied anti-submarine tactics were also evolving rapidly. Convoy support groups consisting of destroyers, frigates and corvettes worked in tandem with aircraft to patrol transit routes and actively hunted U-boats. ASDIC accuracy improved, forcing U-boats to dive to 140 meters or more. Allied aircraft even dropped sonic buoys emitting ASDIC noises to simulate destroyers and keep U-boats submerged. German torpedo technology also suffered from reliability issues. The impact pistol could not be relied upon at certain track angles, and the magnetic pistol was still not reliable. In the first 6 months of 1942, 806 torpedo hits were needed to sink 404 ships, a ratio that spoke volumes about their inefficiency. The U-boat arm, once perceived as the decisive weapon for Germany, was struggling to adapt. The increasing effectiveness of Allied radar and air power, coupled with Germany's own technological and bureaucratic shortcomings, was quickly turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. By late 1942, the U-boat campaign was a desperate but ultimately failing attempt to adapt to Allied advancements. Despite increased operational efforts and some localized successes, the Germans faced internal technological shortcomings and overestimations of their own effectiveness. For months, U-boat command had been receiving exaggerated claims of sinkings. It was not a deliberate morale-boosting tactic. Rather, it was due to the extreme difficulty of accurate assessment in the chaos of convoy battles. Commanders made their claims in good faith. However, this intelligence discrepancy masked the growing effectiveness of Allied countermeasures and led to flawed strategic decisions. Despite this, U-boat numbers were growing, with 18 to 20 new boats entering service per month. In August and September 1942, overall tonnage mounted to around 650,000 tons. Technological improvements were desperately sought. New torpedoes were under development. The compressed air torpedo with a bubble track, the G7AFAT, requiring radar ranging and electric propulsion torpedoes expected later. These aimed to counter faster Allied vessels. New engines were also tested to increase surface speed, but proved unreliable. Experimental Daimler-Benz engines on U.180 and U.195 led to prolonged trials and eventual replacement. Advanced observation equipment like the helicopter-type kite, the FA-330 water wagtail, was deployed for aerial observation up to 150 meters. A prototype Colibri helicopter was even tested for ship use. These were innovative but often faced reliability or stability issues. German radio intelligence achieved remarkable successes penetrating British code and cipher systems. It took 1 or 2 days to decrypt the British radio messages, and on occasions only a few hours were required between the time of original transmission and the arrival of the message in our intelligence center. This provided a crucial, albeit temporary, counterbalance, allowing them to predict Allied responses, position their wolf packs. The German decryption service provided vital intelligence, allowing for successful attacks. However, the numerical increase of escort vessels and their universal equipment with radar had greatly increased U-boat difficulties and dangers. The range limitations of radar at close quarters and the diminishing returns as range closed to between 1,000 and 1,500 meters forced U-boats to adapt new tactics. Admiral Donitz, frustrated by the lack of air reconnaissance, emphasized the critical need for better intelligence. One of the most intense periods of this struggle came in March 1943, a precursor to Black May. German U-boats deployed 74 boats on Atlantic operations. On March 8, the Newland Group launched an attack on SC-121, sinking 13 ships totaling 62,000 tons. A day later, HX-228 was sighted at the southern end of a patrol line. U-221, commanded by Troja, executed a brilliant submerged attack, sinking 6 ships totaling 50,000 tons. The pinnacle of this period was the biggest convoy operation of the war against HX-229 and SC. 32 ships aggregating 136,000 tons were claimed sunk. The Germans never came so near disrupting communication between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. Allied air escorts became a decisive factor, limiting submerged attacks. The introduction of the first escort carrier for convoy protection against HX-230 signaled a new era of sustained air cover, a significant blow to U-boat operations. Even when German decryption identified a rendezvous for ONS-1 and a patrol line was formed, hurricane conditions and strong air escorts prevented effective attacks. The strain on U-boat personnel was immense. The constant threat and demanding nature of operations took a severe toll on crews and commanders. This period marks the beginning of the end for U-boat dominance in the Atlantic. The Allies were gaining a decisive upper hand through technological superiority and coordinated tactics, setting the stage for the critical battles of the coming months. Yet, despite German overestimation of their perceived successes, the effectiveness of U-boat operations was already in steady decline by early 1943. Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities were rapidly evolving. Sophisticated radar systems on escort vessels now significantly hampered U-boat approaches, often detecting them at considerable distances. The shift of U-boat focus to Mediterranean-bound convoys initially proved disappointing. Desperate measures were considered, even stationing individual boats off U.S. ports. But by March 4, 1943, a major patrol line was formed for operations against convoy UGS-6, a big convoy with stragglers. During operations from March 12 to 19, U-boat commanders attempted submerged attacks, a less effective method, forced by Allied defenses. The Allied remote screen, employed by escorts, utilized radar to detect and pursue U-boats from 10 to 15 miles away. This forced a radical shift away from traditional surface attacks. German intelligence failures, fueled by inflated claims and incomplete post-war analysis, masked this true deterioration. They claimed 9 ships aggregating 56,000 tons were sunk against convoy on 176 between April 7th and 13th, while British figures recorded only 2 smaller ships lost. U-boat staff were increasingly anxious over these ASW developments. A critical turning point emerged with the documented realization that enemy destroyers could detect U-boats by radar even when their conning towers were barely visible. This led to new instructions for distant shadowing. The increasing integration of carrier-borne aircraft into convoy escorts created a powerful aerial deterrent. By mid-February 1943, the RAF effectively deployed 10 centimeters, a /S radar or ASV, for day patrols in the Bay of Biscay, marking a significant shift in air-sea ASW power. This advanced technology was a stark contrast to the primitive METOX receiver used by U-boats which struggled to register enemy radar transmissions, though FU-MB allowed some shadowing. Even in remote areas, like the Sea Hund Group off South Africa, internal German acknowledgement of unsatisfactory experiences signaled a broader decline. U-15 torpedoes failed to detonate due to faulty depth keeping. Yet, U.510, with an efficient magnetic pistol, managed to sink 3 ships totaling 18,000 tons and damage 5 Liberty ships aggregating 36,000 tons against convoy BT-6. A rare success. In March 1943, sent boats to the Caribbean, and U.118 mined the Strait of Gibraltar on March 2nd. In April, U.117 mined Casablanca and Faidola. U.160 attacked a convoy south of Durban on March 3rd, and Basic sighted an eastbound convoy off Bahia on February 28th. Despite these scattered operations, German estimates of sinkings in March 1943 reached the second highest peak of the war, a figure that would later be revealed as significantly inflated. By April 1943, 98 U-boats left for operations, with 70 involved in convoy battles. On April 3rd, the Leeuwenhoek's group proceeded westward, making contact with HX-231 the following day. U.262 sighted convoy HX-233. On April 15th, and von Trotha, commander of U.306, noted efficient shadowing and attacks on HX-201, his very first operation. This period, marked by operations like those against convoy RS-3 west of the Canaries, which resulted in 3 ships sunk, was overshadowed by the growing threat. The post-war understanding would reveal that the U-boat paradise of the early war had ended, replaced by a battle against increasingly sophisticated and effective Allied defenses. The supposed collapse of the Atlantic campaign in May 1943 would take the German High Command by complete surprise, a consequence of this masked deterioration. The critical percentage of losses relative to boats at sea. Not absolute numbers was the true indicator of the campaign's deteriorating health. By May 1943, the situation had indeed become very different. The failure of the U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic was a direct result of overwhelming Allied advancements in anti-submarine warfare. This was particularly true of their radar technology and coordinated defensive tactics, which ultimately rendered U-boat offensive capabilities obsolete and unsustainable. Allied decryption of German U-boat communications, what they called radio intelligence, provided precise convoy routes and timings, allowing them to outmaneuver U-boat dispositions. In contrast, German attempts to predict Allied movements were increasingly unsuccessful. Collisions between U-boats, errors in navigation, and relentless losses due to enemy action severely hampered operational effectiveness. A critical turning point was the intense battle against convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May. Despite 60 U-boats being involved in this single operation, Plan 53, the highest number ever, the Allies enhanced ASW measures, including radar-guided gunfire and effective escort coordination, inflicted heavy losses. U-boats himself labeled this a reverse. It was a stark demonstration that surface escorts, when supported by radar, could inflict grave losses and effectively counter strong U-boat concentrations. The primitive METOX receiver on U-boats was unable to register enemy radar frequencies, rendering them effectively blind in fog and darkness, conditions where U-boats had once held an advantage. The enemy radar's increasing effectiveness became the primary reason for U-boat failures, allowing escorts to attack with devastating precision. This realization of the radar menace and METOX limitations led to frantic scientific efforts to develop effective countermeasures. Operations continued in other theaters, such as the Freetown area, where an average of 4 U-boats sank 5 independent ships. One commander even claimed 8 ships, sunk from a single convoy, a total of 50,000 tons, thanks to a pi. 2 inches magnetic pistol achieving most satisfactory results with shallow depth settings. But these were isolated successes. In the North Atlantic, on April 1, 1943, 60 U-boats were divided into 4 groups for Plan 53. On April 28, convoy ONS-5 passed the northern wing of the Star Group. Yet even with such close proximity, U-boats in the Fink Group had not located convoy SC-128 by May 4. On May 5, 15 boats made contact with ONS-5 in good visibility, but a sudden descent of fog led to a loss of opportunity, compounded by effective escort attacks. By May 6, 1943, the pursuit of ONS-5 had to be abandoned, a desperate entry in the FOM. U-boat's diary highlighting the urgent need for radar countermeasures. The loss of 6 U-boats against ONS-5 was a profound blow. The campaign's collapse was a strategic defeat for Germany in the Battle of the Atlantic. It led to the temporary evacuation of the North Atlantic by May 1943, signaling the definitive end of the U-boat's offensive capacity in this vital theater. Admiral Domitz himself felt the personal cost of this escalating attrition. His second son was serving as a watchkeeping officer on U.954, which was lost in the failure against convoy SC-130. The whole future of the U-boat war now depended on developing a counter to this overwhelming enemy. Radar. May 1943 proved to be the critical month. The German U-boat campaign faced a devastating turning point, marked by overwhelming Allied air and surface superiority. By May 22, a staggering 31 boats had already been lost. Of these, 19, or about 60%, were sunk while proceeding to or from the operational area or while waiting in that area. 17, approximately 55%, were almost certainly lost through air attacks. This debunks the myth that U-boat losses were primarily from direct attacks on convoys. A significant proportion occurred during transit or while waiting, largely due to air power. The FO U-boats analysis, while noting air attack dominance, potentially mischaracterized the danger during actual convoy battles. The introduction and effectiveness of Allied radar equipment allowed for surprise air attacks on U-boats, especially when they were vulnerable on the surface. The sheer scale of these losses forced a radical shift in strategy. In the first half of 1942, the loss of each U-boat was compensated by the sinking of 272,000 tons of Allied shipping. By the first quarter of 1943, this figure had plummeted to 51,000 tons. But in May 1943, the Germans achieved the sinking of only one ship of 8,500 tons for the loss of each U-boat. In total, Germany lost 38 U-boats and sank only 42 ships that May. On May 22, 1943, a secret order was issued to commanding officers, mandating U-boats remain submerged in bad visibility. In clear weather, they were to proceed at high speed on the surface with manned anti-aircraft guns. At night, they were to run silently. This represented a temporary abandonment of the campaign's fundamental principles. Then, on May 24, 1943, the strategic decision was made. Withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Operations were to shift to the southwest of the Azores, targeting U.S. Gibraltar convoys, or to act as decoys for boats with insufficient fuel. It was the first time a vital battlefield, like the North Atlantic, had to be evacuated due to Allied defensive strength. The decisive battleground in the North Atlantic would only be resumed after U-boats were equipped with superior offensive and defensive weapons. Our serious U-boat losses, as the FO boat losses, U-boats noted, could be mainly ascribed to the superiority of enemy radar equipment. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest-running continuous military campaign of World War II, was truly a desperate struggle. Winston Churchill himself confessed that U-boats were the only thing that truly frightened him. This 6-year conflict, spanning vast ocean areas and involving thousands of ships, was fueled by Germany's counter-blockade against the Allied naval blockade. The high operational tempo and continuous deployments of U-boats represented a sustained effort to challenge Allied supply lines. However, the raw data of U-boat fates paints a stark picture of attrition warfare, directly challenging any notion of a consistently successful German operation. Instance was sunk on March 22, 1943, 563, followed on April 14. Then came U.63, 8, lost on April 6, 8, 686 on May 2, and U.638b on May 5. U.657 sank on May 14, while U.954, carrying Admiral Donitz's son, was lost on May 19. These dates, concentrated in late 1942 and early to mid-1943, highlight a period of increasing Allied effectiveness and a precipitous decline in U-boat operational viability. The data showcases the relentless nature of this battle, with boats like U.582 showing multiple sailed entries before its ultimate sinking on October 5, 1942. Even shifts to other operational areas, such as Mediterranean deployments for some U-boats, could not stem the tide. Across the entire war, a staggering 781 U-boats were lost, compared to the 2,775 Allied merchant ships sunk. This signified a substantial drain on German resources and manpower, contributing significantly to their eventual defeat. The U-boat campaign, despite its initial terrifying impact, was ultimately unsuccessful in crippling Allied supply lines. Its failure underscored the triumph of Allied technological superiority and coordinated defense in the Battle of the Atlantic.